Okay, here we go.
Hello and welcome. My name is Maggie Phillips. I am the religion correspondent here at Tablet, and I would like to thank all of you out there in TV land and welcome you to our webinar this evening. And I'd also like to extend a warm welcome and thank you to our two distinguished guests, David French, senior editor at the Dispatch, and Rabbi Ari Lamm of Too Many Enterprises for me to remember off the top of my head. Right, I'll read your biography in a minute. We'll go through it all. But yeah, real quick before we get started, I'm going to give a little bit of background on kind of how this evening came into being. We'll go through the bios and we'll get right into it. Kind of like much like Sesame Street, Sesame Street's The Count, or if you prefer Grover. My work at Tablet is funded by a generous grant from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Where my portfolio differs a little bit from theirs is it's to increase religious literacy among our readers. And so I thought David French, Ari Lamm, two guys who are already doing religious literacy and have thought very deeply about why it's important to understand kind of the religious background behind America's history, America's sort of discourse. And so I got them here together to talk about that this evening. So I'll read their biographies and then we'll get started. Does that sound good? All right. So David French is a senior editor at the Dispatch and a columnist for Time. Together with Curtis Chang, he hosts Good Faith, a podcast about the intersection of politics, nature, and law. A graduate of Harvard Law School, David is a former senior writer for National Review and a former senior fellow at the National Review Institute. He's a former constitutional litigator and a past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. David is a New York Times bestselling author, and his most recent book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, was released last September. David is a former major in the United States Army Reserve and is a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm is co-founder and president of Soul Shop Studios, a new media venture for faith-driven Gen Z audiences, and chief executive of the B'nai Zion Foundation. He's a leading Jewish public intellectual using digital media to bring great Jewish ideas to the wider English-speaking public. He's the host of the top-ranked weekly podcast on the Bible and Society, Good Faith Effort, and his popular Twitter threads on why read the Bible in Hebrew, which David and I were both just praising before you came on, have garnered over 4 million views to date and been covered by major international news outlets. So, gentlemen, thank you so much again for joining me this evening. You both.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
I'm so excited. Do you have to have a podcast with Good Faith in the title to be on here?
I was gonna, you took my first question. Yeah, you both do. And you both deal with they both deal with the intersection of faith and society, right? Through the lenses of your kind of respective religious traditions.
Well, you know, there's David's the varsity on the JV, but it's still pretty good.
I don't think so. But yeah, I was struck by that as well. But, you know, great minds think alike. I mean, there's already a lot of cross-pollination because I have put at least 2 of Rabbi Lamm's Twitter threads in my Sunday newsletter, to much acclaim, by the way, from my readers who really awesome. Have universally appreciated him. I can't say they universally appreciate me. So well, thanks for having us.
As one of the readers, I was very in favor.
You can't make all the people happy all the time, you know. But yeah, I did actually want to talk to you about this coincidence that you both have these podcasts with these titles, because I'd like you to talk a little bit about the intended audiences for both of these projects and why why you started them in the first place, what the impetus was. Whoever wants to take that first.
David, you want to go first?
Sure. So the reason Curtis and I started our podcast is pretty simple. And that is that we felt like there was the original impetus was there was a real hole in sort of the thinking about how Christianity impacts politics and culture, not so much around the what. In other words, if you're in evangelical circles, there's tons of conversations about issues. This is what you should think about this issue. This is what you should think about that issue. But sadly, there's a lot less conversation about the how. How are you to interact in the world? In what way, in what manner do you bring your faith into the world? And actually, sort of a cornerstone verse about our approach is from the Old Testament book of Micah 6:8, which is, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly, it is to love kindness, and it is to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And we have a huge amount of emphasis in this world over the act justly part. What is it? What's right? What's right? And then we have less emphasis on the kindness and the humility. And so what we wanted to do was kind of rebalance the ledger and discuss the how, the kindness of it, and the humility, as much as we talk about the justice. So kind of reordering how we approach the public square. And then as we've done the podcast now for more than a year, we branch into all kinds of different things. So we just had a really fascinating podcast with a former bank robber turned Christian lawyer and ministry leader, and about prison reform and criminal justice reform and his journey. So we're going to talk to interesting people from different perspectives with as much of an emphasis on how we interact with the world as we have with what are the policies that we're going to advance.
So I it's so fun as an avid listener of Good Faith. It's so cool to hear my instincts about why I love the show so confirmed by the creator. That's great. I'll tell you, when I think about Good Faith Effort, my podcast, I always tell people this is a grasshopper podcast. And what I mean by that is it's a reference to a verse in the book of Numbers, when Moses sends out scouts to scout out the promised land, and they sort of infamously come back and say, well, it's a great place, but we'll get slaughtered if we try to conquer it. And this results in God being very upset and punishing them and, condemning them to death and 40 years wandering in the desert. The line that they use to express why they don't think the Israelites can make it into the promised land in Hebrew is "V'nehi ve'einenu kechagavim v'chein hayinu be'eineihem," which in English means we seem like grasshoppers in our eyes, and we look the same, and we look like therefore grasshoppers in their eyes. And there's a tendency I think in kind of like the Orthodox Jewish tradition from which I emerged, but in the larger faith-driven landscape of America in general, which is to think about faith, our texts, our values, our traditions as, the sort of thing that no one else should or would care about. We can barely get ourselves to care about them. And so they're probably not that important. And to the extent that we talk about them and we explore them and love them, it's a very intra-communal or intra-tribal conversation. And when you look at the history of the West and the history of the American Republic in particular, it is absolutely incoherent without the biblical tradition. I mean, nothing about it makes sense. Our institutions, our history, our grand narratives, and even our failures, nothing makes sense without the history and tradition of the Bible. And so I kind of said to myself, okay, I want to talk to the coolest possible people, at least the ones that I can find, in whatever field, whether it's music, film, politics, faith leadership, historians, etc., anyone who's doing really excellent work in their field. And I want to talk about how some big idea from the Bible either informs what they're doing or helps illuminate it, or can maybe, help them think about their own work in a way they wouldn't have otherwise. And that's kind of how it is. So, we've had, some of my favorite sports writers on, we've had some of my favorite historians on, we've even had a Oscar-winning producer on, and Van Lathan. That was an awesome episode. And so, yeah, it's been a blast.
I was excited. You had Michael Ian Black on, didn't you?
Michael Ian Black. in one of the earliest, I don't even know if David, you remember this, one of my first episodes, I actually had you come on and you were unbelievable. I was terrible. But it was like, maybe I think it was the first episode that we dropped. Like I had pre-recorded it, but this was like 2 years ago.
It was the very first. I'm honored that it was the first episode. I did not know that.
It was one of the early episodes.
Oh, wow.
Really, really early. I think the Michael Ian Black one came out a couple episodes later, and I was already starting to like figure out what the podcast was. But yeah, this has been like a super fun journey. I've been psyched. I kind of did the podcast for like, one or two friends who I thought would appreciate it. And so to see people really enjoy it has been a blast.
Well, I mean, so the Michael Ian Black, he's an atheist, right? Like,
yeah.
Right. So I wanted to circle back to that because I mean, like, so you have this Good Faith podcast and you have Michael Ian Black, comedian, atheist. David, Good Faith is not your only podcast. It's not your only podcast. And I used to listen to you and Alexander DeSanctis when you had your podcast. And
right.
Even though you both agreed on like abortion access issues, she's Catholic and you're Protestant, you support different basketball teams like that. So to what extent would you say curiosity about others and their beliefs enables you to engage productively with them? Like either,
I would just say for me, that's going back to that Micah 6:8 formulation, the walk humbly. To me, curiosity is an indispensable element of that, because one of the things when you're trying to walk in this world humbly, it means you're going in and you're saying, I don't know everything. There is a lot I don't know. You can teach me things, right? And so one of my favorite things about not just the podcast, the Good Faith podcast, but my job in general, is that it is a job of continual exploration and continual learning. And I'm just not going to be good at it if I'm not curious, if I'm not seeking more information. I mean, who's ever heard of a good journalist who's not curious? But I would say that is just an absolutely indispensable element. And, and also just sort of within that biblical framework, that humility, in in the New Testament, there's this verse that says, we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. Each one of us has partial information at all times. And it's that quest for ever more complete information. Just move that needle a little bit more towards more knowledge, I think is one of the most fulfilling aspects, not just of my job, it's one of the most fulfilling things that we can do as human beings, period.
Yeah. Rabbi Lamm, do you have any thoughts on like curiosity and how it helps engage productively with folks?
Yeah, I think one of the core questions that particularly believers in monotheistic faiths, I suppose, face on like a regular basis is like, why do anything, right? Anything other than like praying to God or studying texts or whatever it is, like why do literally anything? And because opportunity cost, anything that you're doing could, isn't that time that could be better spent praying or studying or what have you. And I remember a teacher of mine once said that it's true if you're being asked to justify the spiritual, theological, moral value of like knowing the difference between Monet and Manet, or knowing the difference between different types of pufferfish, or like, going to a Nets game versus a Knicks game. Well, that latter one is a big difference. But other than those things, like knowing those things are trivial. But it's when you weave the whole tapestry of creation together and you stand there struck dumb by how just majestic it is, and you become almost overwhelmed. And how can you see anything but creation's author when you behold the whole thing? And so to me, the podcast is just like a very thinly veiled excuse for me to engage in that in a way that for me sometimes feels self-indulgent, but I hope comes across as just curious in the sense that I think God would want us to be curious, right? God says in the first chapter of Genesis that his charge to human beings is v'chiv shuha, which literally means to subdue creation, right? Like explore it, understand it, behold it in all of its magnificence. And so being on the podcast, you get to talk to people who are just doing interesting things at a really high level of excellence in so many different areas of the human experience. And once you weave that, like any one detail from any one conversation, could I justify that on spiritual grounds? Probably not. But once you weave the whole thing together, I think what comes out of it is this sense of wonder. There's a wonderful story told about a great 19th century Jewish thinker from Germany, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And the story that's told about him is that, he arranged for a family trip to the Alps, to see the Alps. And a student asked him, like, why are you wasting your time going on a hike? You could be doing writing and teaching. And he said, when I pass away and I come before the heavenly throne, God is going to ask me, did you behave properly? I tried. Did you spend your time in virtuous things and virtuous pursuits? I tried. But one of the things he's going to ask me is, Samson, did you see my Alps? And
I love that story.
And I think that's a really powerful thing. Like, did you see the Alps? That's one of the things I try to keep in mind during doing the pod.
Yeah, I've always loved that story. So sweet. Yeah, and I think that curiosity, it's definitely on display when you do like why read the Bible in Hebrew. Like, can you think of any particular threads that you put in your Sunday newsletter that people have really responded to? Like, what were
the Tower of Babel thread? And
yeah.
Rabbi, was that the first thread that just really blew up?
It was like they've all gone like, they've all gotten way more response and interest than I ever imagined, but that one really kind of took off. And it was funny because I was actually in I didn't have service for about 3 hours that morning. I was like in a car ride in a rural area. And I remember when my phone got service back, I was like, oh, I need to shut this off. It was unusual.
Yeah, but it seemed to be overwhelmingly positive, which to me was an interesting symbol of how much hunger there is out there for just, for insight, to be honest. Just there was a real hunger. Here's this ancient story that only some people know the basic outlines of. If you quiz the average American, what's the Tower of Babel story? How many out of 100 can even begin to say it, right? But there's enough curiosity, and this is what I found with my Sunday newsletter. There is an enormous amount of curiosity about faith. Enormous. And there is also a subgroup of people in the faith world who don't know how to communicate about faith to people who are not super religious. It's all in-group language all the time, right? And so it just looks opaque to people. And what was, I thought, wonderful about Rabbi Lamm's thread was it made something that would ordinarily be extremely opaque, Hebrew and the Old Testament, right? And made it plain and made it clear. And I feel like in my own life, there are some things I write where I'm trying to sort of get across a point of view. And sometimes I'm writing to try to explain other people's points of view in a way that makes sense to people. One of my favorite newsletters I ever wrote was called Satanic Pregnancies Explained. And it was about Paula White.
Yes, that was my favorite edition of the Sunday newsletter ever. It was so good. It took something that people thought was so like indefensibly odd and demystified it in a way that was validating and like respectful.
Right. Well, if you don't know anything about Pentecostal Christianity, you would see that and you would think that what are, and then, so I just tried to explain step by step where this was coming from. And to be honest, those are some of my favorite things to write, is demystifying things that should be demystified, or in some ways remystifying things in a way that makes them more profound than you might realize that they are. And I think that's one of the geniuses of Rabbi, your threads, is you kind of restore a sense of awe and wonder to some of these Bible stories that most people just know as like, this happened and this happened and this happened.
And I'll tell you, what was so interesting in doing the thread was, and in seeing that it resonated, which I was so grateful for, was in many ways it kind of restores this lost tradition of American Hebrewism. And there is, just like one of my favorite stories. So Ezra Stiles is one of the great thinkers of the founding era. His biographer rightly referred to him as the most learned man in America. And this was a time when Benjamin Franklin was alive. So just to give you a sense of how brilliant he was, super influential. Of course, he was very good friends with Franklin, corresponded with all the other founders. He was the president of Yale during the American Revolution and went on to found Brown University. So he was like 2 for 7 or 8, whatever it was. And Stiles was an incredible lover of Hebrew. But this is at a time when Hebrew instruction was like pretty regular at Harvard. He brought it with him to Yale. And during the American Revolution, so Yale kind of went remote, like we just had everything go remote during the pandemic. So Yale went remote. They didn't have in-person commencements beginning in 1775 until 2 weeks before the Battle of Yorktown. About 2 weeks before the Battle of Yorktown, they have their first in-person commencement exercises, and Ezra Stiles is the president of Yale. And he steps up to the podium and he delivers his commencement address, the first one since the suspension of exercises in 1775. And it's a Hebrew address. He composed it in Hebrew. He translated it into English when he delivered it, but then he ends up publishing it in Hebrew. And it's called An Oration Upon the Hebrew Literature. And he talks about the importance, in his view, for a Christian nation, but for America as a whole. He talks about, first of all, the experience that he has had learning Hebrew and studying Hebrew texts, and then he talks about the importance of that intellectual tradition and how generative it is. And then he says that he believes, trying to remember the Hebrew, but in English, what he says is, with heartfelt desire, I have desire to see these studies become foundational at all of the colleges and universities of America, which in Hebrew he calls Batei Midrash Shel America. A Beit Midrash is like a traditional rabbinic study house. And there's this moment in American life where, and it goes all the way back to the Mayflower, by the way, there's this moment in American life in the history of the American experiment where America just understands its deep indebtedness to this political, intellectual, moral tradition. And it lasts, that indebtedness lasts, I mean, all the way until today, but it self-consciously lasts for an incredibly long time. And it's preserved at some of the most important moments in American history. And so I kind of felt, like you said, David, that in a certain sense, it's not just, demystifying, you're remystifying, right? It's like taking things that Americans and America once knew and should remember, and kind of reminding them, as opposed to introducing something new.
Yeah, and you've hit on how that kind of historical religious literacy can help us have a better appreciation of kind of where we came from. David, I was wondering if you could speak to how religious literacy helps us today with policy debates, with culture war stuff. Where does that come in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things I think is really important right now, we're in a real debate and a real fight over the nature of the American government itself. So, for example, classical liberalism, sort of this concept of limited government and individual rights, is under fire from often from surprising quarters. Sort of the founding principles of the country are under fire. And I think that religious literacy can help us understand some of the actual religious roots and faith-informed thinking that created the structure in the first place. It's very interesting to me, for example, to take one example regarding religious liberty in the American tradition of religious liberty. And we all know the American founding the ideals of the American founding were not manifested immediately in the new nation. But there were early glimmers, for example, of how these American ideals would work out over time. And one of my favorite examples of the early glimmers was George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island. And what's really interesting when you read that letter, it's not that long. It should be among the founding documents that every school child reads, I think. You know, you read the Declaration of Independence. More people need to read John Adams' letter to the Massachusetts militia for reasons I can talk about. And more people need to read George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Rhode Island. And in that letter, he uses, Micah's a popular prophet in this podcast today. He uses a reference from the book of Micah, Micah 4:4. Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. Incredibly powerful statement sent to this incredibly embattled religious minority in a new nation that is wondering, where do we fit, right? In this new country, where do we fit? And what does the first president of this new republic say? Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And that took me down a Micah 4:4 rabbit hole with George Washington. And it turns out that he used this almost 50 times, that exact phrase, almost 50 times in his writings. And so front of mind for George Washington was this concept of every person having a place, every person having a home, and living in that place and that home with a sense of peace and security. And it's just fascinating to me that that whole concept was revitalized by the musical Hamilton, where that verse is used in the musical Hamilton. And it shows a strain, a historical strain about how the system that was designed is rooted in some really powerful biblical wisdom, and that biblical wisdom still resonates today. And if possible, it might even resonate more today as America is more diverse and you have more different communities that are looking into this republic and saying, do we fit here or do we not? And that at which point, you know, the George Washingtons of the present time should say, every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid.
Yeah. Can you think of any contemporary issues right now where it might be helpful if people have more religious literacy? I'm sure that's probably like drinking from a fire hose for you. Like it's probably like,
you know, honestly, I would say there is it's hard. It's actually easier. It's actually would be more easy to say, or let me put it this way. What issues are there any issues where more religious literacy wouldn't help? In other words, religious literacy is, I think, indispensable to understanding the human condition and understanding the human soul and the human spirit. And so, you know, in virtually any policy is then going to be filtered through, you take the ideals of a policy, which are many times rooted in faith-based senses of justice, for example, and then their operation is then filtered through human beings, and human beings are indelibly shaped by their faith or their lack thereof. They're certainly indelibly shaped by their moral sense. And then this will bring me to John Adams' letter to a Massachusetts militia, in where he said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. And a lot of people object to that sentence because he says moral and religious. I think it's pretty clear from context what he's meaning is it's designed for a moral people. It's a design for, there are such a thing as immoral religious people, and there's such a thing as moral irreligious people, but it definitely needs a moral people. And because the Constitution, which protects individual liberty and an enormous amount of individual autonomy, is not strong enough. The way Adams put it is that particular vices and sins, as he put it, would break the cords of our Constitution like a whale going through a net. And so where does this morality come from? Where does this moral sense come from? And that's where religious literacy is going to tell us historically where it's come from. It's also going to provide us a moral frame for where it's going to come from in the future.
I think also it is, I love the way you put that, David, like where wouldn't this help? If I could point to just like maybe one or two examples. Number one, I think the intellectual basis for American liberalism, and by the way, like one of your best newsletters, one I enjoyed the most, was A Christian Defense of American Classical Liberalism. It was such a good piece. And it really shaped how I think. The First of all, the intellectual basis for the American project is rooted in both, I'd say, a partnership between the world of science, progress, the Enlightenment ideals, and the world of faith and hope. And both of those things are product of biblical thinking. Number one, the possibility of modern science, the idea that the world is a predictable place and actually can be modeled and is well ordered. That idea is introduced to the world by biblical monotheism. The idea that we're not subject to the random capricious desires of a variety of, of a potpourri of nefarious gods who, every now and then will throw us a bone. That notion is introduced to us by the Bible. The world is as well ordered. So that's modern science for you right there. And then the idea of history is moving in a particular direction. That's another innovation of biblical monotheism. There is no end times. There's no eschatology. There's no teleology in any of the pagan religions that the Bible supplanted. The notion that actually not just we as individuals, but we as a society are moving towards a hopeful and redemptive end is an innovation of the biblical worldview. And the American project is incomprehensible without that. One of the phrases that Martin Luther King Jr. is both most famous for, and that makes some people most uncomfortable, is his notion, which he paraphrased, but he put so beautifully, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, isn't that just magical thinking, right? Critics will reply, right? I mean, certainly the bends towards justice. I mean, someone has to bend it, right? Like we have to do things. What do you mean it bends towards justice? No, King actually meant that quite literally. If you read anything that King writes, you'll understand that he saw history as unfolding according to the both warnings and promises of the Hebrew prophets, right? He saw that on the one hand, the truth of what Lincoln said in the second inaugural, which is that for every drop of blood drawn by the sword will be another repaid by, or every drop of blood drawn by the lash will be paid for by one drawn by the sword. He saw that America would be punished for its sins, but he also saw that God would redeem the Israelites from Egypt. He saw that America actually did have a future, that justice would roll down like a mighty stream. He really understood that we were moving in a good direction. And the only question we had to ask ourselves was what role we wanted to play in our redemption. And it was that faith, that understanding of teleology that's totally indebted to the Bible. And the last notion I would say is the biblical idea of idolatry is also, I think, completely essential for American civics and American politics, both in understanding, for example, just to go back to King for a second, what racism is and why it's bad. My grandfather and teacher, Rabbi Lamm, one of the great American Jewish orators of all time, actually described the problem of American racism as an idolatry. Or if you go back to the American founding, the entire idea that America must be a republic and monarchy is not only inconvenient or inefficient, it's actually wrong. That is rooted directly, as Thomas Paine himself noted, in John Milton's formulation of monarchy as an idolatry. And John Milton took that directly from the Bible and the Jewish commentaries that he read in Hebrew. But before that, all you have is Aristotle. Aristotle says it doesn't really matter what government you have. We believe in constitutional pluralism. There are some, bad governments by one person, that's tyranny, and there's some good ones, that's monarchy. There's some bad governments by some, that's oligarchy, and there's some good governments by some people, that's aristocracy. There's a good version of rule by all, that's what he calls just constitutionalism, and there's a bad version of rule by all, which he confusingly calls democracy. But that, until the Reformation and the West's incredible rediscovery of Hebraic thought and political tradition, which is spearheaded by the Protestant Reformation, Aristotle reigns supreme. You have nothing to counteract that. It's only with the rediscovery of the biblical political tradition, of what the thinkers of the 17th century called the Hebrew Republic, that you get the notion that, in fact, monarchy is not just inefficient, it's actually idolatrous, or potentially idolatrous. And so our entire political structure, the notion that it actually is a good thing for us all to maintain the structures and institutions of liberalism, owes itself to the Bible, and we will lose it if we forget those foundations.
Well, I am learning so much. Thank you. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, but before we started the webinar, David and I were talking about how even if one is not religious within America, even if you're a not religious American, which increasingly more and more people are, you might not be interested in religion, but religion is interested in you by dint of the fact that you live in America. And David, what did you say about like the most religious advanced? We're like the most religious advanced. Could you repeat
America,
that?
right? America is arguably the most religious advanced democracy in the world. In other words, so if you look at the most developed economies in the world, you know, if you're going to Northern Europe, if you're going to Western Europe, if you're going to Japan, if you're going from Australia, you name it, anywhere in the world of these advanced developed democracies, we're far more religious. I mean, Europe in particular is a religious wasteland by comparison to the United States. Now, the interesting thing is the American sort of elite is not necessarily all that religious. The American governing and cultural elite is sort of less religious than the larger population. And I told you, Maggie, beforehand, an old joke that if the most religious country in the world is India and the least religious country in the world is Sweden, then America is a nation of Hindus governed by Swedes. That and that actually there's, you know, it's a joke, it's too broad a brush, but there's a kernel of truth there, that there is actually a gap often between the most elite quarters of American society and the lives lived by hundreds of millions of Americans from coast to coast, where there's sort of a lack of understanding of the importance and prominence of religious faith and religious practice to their daily lives, and often a real lack of comprehension of the moral frame and even the way of communicating to people in a way that connects at that heart level. And so that's why, you know, especially in America's, you know, when I'll just give you a quick story that illustrates this. I grew up in a very small town in Kentucky, about 8,000, went to a small Christian college in Nashville, you know, not just the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, but like the Jerusalem of the Bible Belt. And then I go to law school at Harvard. Well, that was a new experience for me, really different from everything I'd grown up with before. And I ran into more than one person who said this to me: I've never met an evangelical Christian in my life. I've never met one. And these are people at, you know, arguably one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the world, training ground for the American governing class. And they'd never even met an evangelical Christian, which struck me at the time. I was just gobsmacked by that. Are you kidding me? Where did you live? New York. Oh, okay. That's a pretty big place, right? Never met an evangelical. And so that kind of division often between a much more secular governing and cultural elite in the US and the much more religious, larger population is a source of a lot of friction and tension in American life. And closing that gap of knowledge is important, I think, for both sides of that cultural divide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, certainly David Rabbi Lamm, from where you sit, can you think of any example, like kind of what David's talking about, where it's you encounter people who are like, well, I didn't know this about, you know, I'm sure you have stories like that.
Yeah, well, you know, part of the fun of being an Orthodox Jew is like you're always wearing your superhero costume, right? So I will tell you one of the most unfortunate quirks that American polite society has developed in the last, it feels like a decade, but it could be, give or take a couple of years, is anathematizing the question of where are you from?
Mm.
And the joke I remember, my wife and I lived in London for a year. My eldest daughter was born there. That's why she's very polite and has bad teeth. But when we lived there, the joke that we always heard was the difference between Europe and America is that in Europe, they ask you, the first question you get asked is where are you from? In America, they ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up? And
Mhm.
I think that actually there is, I'm betraying my American chauvinism here, but I do think there is some truth to that. And it is a wonderful thing about America. But you can learn so much about a person by knowing where they come from, not just locationally, geographically, but missionally, in terms of your culture, your values, your texts, the experiences that have shaped you. And I wish Americans were more comfortable asking people where they come from. And in my case, I come from a community, and I love hearing your story as well, David. And I sometimes worry that, like, in Manhattan, you meet that one evangelical, the one Orthodox Jew, the one, and it's like cultivating like artisanal evangelicals and Orthodox Jews, but
That's
still,
funny.
right. But still, I come from this community, which to an outsider must appear extremely odd, maybe weird and threatening and dark in some ways. Because we dress weird and we stick to each other. We walk in the middle of the road on Shabbos, right, on the Sabbath. And, we don't use electricity, and how come we can't use our phones for, once a week, and all these, like, we sit in huts for 7 days a year. Like, what are all these weird things that we're doing? And the truth is, there is so much richness, wisdom, and beauty to be found in that community. And I feel like not just me, but any person who grew up the way that I did, I feel like our contributions to society, our potential contributions to society, can really only truly be unlocked if we're allowed to be the people who came from where we came. And I'd say, if I had to diagnose why America, developed this neuroses, I suppose the cheap narrative would be, well, it's wokeness or progressivism. And I feel like that's kind of blaming your thermometer for your fever. Where it really came from is America for a very long time has, especially in the wake of kind of like the big waves of immigration to the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s, developed this notion of the melting pot, right? Which is that ideally, the way that America stays healthy and grows healthier is by everyone who comes here just homogenizing. And I'll tell you, I don't think anything could be worse for America, because it's precisely the biblical roots of our nation that teach us this. Every single one of us is created in God's image, and there are no human rights without that. Quite frankly, there's no capitalism without that. There's no idea that each of us has our own unique skills and talents and we should specialize. Like, there's no capitalism without that idea, that each of us is unique, has limitless potential in our own unique ways. But the cool thing about being created in the divine image is that every single one of us bears a different face on top of that divine image. Like, when you look at another person, you can see two things: both that we all are equal, and that also every single one of us is unique and has special skills and talents. And America will flourish, any society will flourish, but particularly one with such biblical roots will flourish precisely when we realize the immutable truths of both of those things, both that every single one of us has equal worth and limitless unique potential.
I guess that leads me to one kind of the last really sort of heavy question I have, which is, people are disaffiliating from traditional religion. Religion and spirituality are both kind of, as they withdraw from the public square, becoming something more personal and private. You kind of have your spiritual but not religious. You have your own set of practices that you take on. If you are traditionally religious, you're kind of expected to keep that to yourself, and it's your own thing. And David, I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on, as we go forward as a country. The First Amendment was written by, you mentioned, the moral and religious people. You know, the Constitution was written between the First and the Second Great Awakenings. When they talked about religious freedom, religion was kind of like, you know, to paraphrase Yuval Levin's whole idea, religion was something that formed you. You know, you didn't form it in your own image. You were completely subsumed by that. So what does religious freedom look like in a country, you know, if you never go to church and don't belong to any formal religion, but you claim you have these religious conscience rights because you have your own sort of spiritual path you've forged? How do you, what does the First Amendment mean in a country like that?
Yeah, that's actually, from a legal standpoint, that's a super easy question to answer. It's a lot harder to answer from a cultural standpoint about sort of what it means as a cultural phenomenon. But from a legal standpoint, the law is really clear that your religious liberty attaches not just to formal religion, but really any sort of belief system that takes the place of religion. So the First Amendment's free exercise clause actually protects atheists as much as it protects people of faith. It's really looking at that source of source of the ultimate. What is the source of your moral purpose and meaning? The way I've described religious liberty is the ability to think, speak, and act according to your deepest beliefs, so long as they don't infringe on another person's rights. And that's sort of the way we think about religious liberty. And that legally, that's easy. Legally to articulate, it took me 5 seconds. To live it that's where it gets a lot more difficult. But one thing that I think we need to do in the American, in our culture wars, is to remember to think about that we are actually living from an historical standpoint in the middle of a miracle. Okay, here's what I mean. If you drive down Franklin Road in Nashville, Tennessee, that's this north-south artery in the middle of Nashville. Maggie, you were here recently. You're probably on Franklin Road at some point. And when you were here, no doubt you saw megachurch after megachurch after megachurch. And Franklin Road has one after the other. And what's notable about it, it also has a lot of churches from different traditions. And so right by Franklin Road, you'll find Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, you'll find synagogues, you'll find various strands of Protestant churches. And if you took a person from, say, 1615 Northern Europe and walked them down that street, they would wonder when the fighting was going to break out. You know, the church bulletin would say something like 9 a.m. mass, 10 a.m. Protestant burning, you know, like it would. So, but we just take that for granted. The fact that people who have differences of opinion on eternal matters can live in peace and harmony with each other and protect each other's liberty. This is one thing that's super important about American religious liberty law. You wouldn't believe how many cases that really matter, that really protect your liberty. Those precedents were set by people from faiths that are fringe faiths or faiths you completely disagree with, but their victory is your victory. And so we have this historical miracle in which these different faiths are living together in peace. And then we accomplish that, but then we believe we can't somehow accomplish living in peace over when the differences are over in temporal matters. So wait, we can live in peace when we have eternal differences, but if it's a temporal difference, then that's just too much. But I think we need to remember one of the most important elements of the American experiment is this miraculous degree of religious liberty and religious peace that exists. And we take it for granted, and we shouldn't. It's not even been the norm often in American history. It wasn't that long ago, for example, that there would be religious-based riots in American cities. You know, I know Gangs of New York is not a documentary, but there were Catholic Protestant street fights back in the day. There were Blaine amendments passed in American state constitutions that were explicitly designed to discriminate against Catholics. And I know I'm not encompassing the full range of American religious discrimination. So we live in a modern miracle, but it's one that should inspire us that if we can agree to live in peace and side by side and protecting each other's freedom to disagree on matters eternal, surely we can learn to disagree and respect each other and still respect each other in matters temporal.
One of my hottest takes is even to somewhat dispute the premise of the question, which is I remember there was a bit of data that came out. I want to say it was like last year or a year and a half ago, that church attendance in America has dipped below 50% for the first time in American history since we've been tracking this. And at the same time, Springtide Research came out with another piece of data, like literally at the same time, that said something like, 77% of Gen Z, sort of young people, roughly defined, say that they're seeking spirituality, whatever that means. 71% define themselves as religious. So how do you square those two things? And the answer is, I think young people or Gen Z is kind of less likely to go to a brick and mortar house of worship, but that's because Gen Z is less likely to do brick and mortar anything, whether it be going to retail stores, going to movie theaters. If you look on TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, Twitch, there is one of the most exciting engines of cool religious stuff going on. Like, there's just so much cool stuff out there. Amazing religious influencers, creators, personalities. Like, it's just so fun to explore and to see. I think that Gen Z kind of feels more comfortable in spaces where they are the ruling class, so to speak. So I suppose that's social media. But I actually am extremely bullish on the future of just religious thought and peoplehood in America as a whole. The rise of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, or people of no religion, is a noteworthy phenomenon. I tend to think that it's kind of breaking off, people who under any other circumstances would have broken off, 6 or 7 decades ago anyway. It's just that, the strictures and structures of American society made it less possible and feasible, and now it's more possible and feasible. But look, religious communities, just from a data standpoint, and I don't mean this in a triumphalist way, but if Silicon Valley is building the software for our future, religious communities are building the hardware, as in the actual people who are going to use it, because we're the ones having kids. But that shouldn't necessarily comfort us, right? Like, if we win by population knockout, that isn't necessarily a comforting win. The question is, like, what kind of religious community survives? But even there, I think there's such room for hope, because if you look, if you take a look at the role that religion has typically played in the human experience, the role that it has been stereotyped as playing in American life is an absolute aberration. And I think it has to do with kind of American religious populism taking off at the same time as the invention of mass media. So American religion has kind of developed this reputation as like an old man, like wagging his finger at people, like, no, you can't do this. But in reality, religion, especially biblical religion, in the history of humanity has always been like total metal and punk rock. Like, it's Abraham standing up to the despots of the ancient Near East and saying, you guys are out of your minds and I refuse. There's biblical religion has always given the most daring thinkers the tools to say no to despotism and tyranny, to say yes to liberty and the goods of freedom. And abolitionism is just one example of a movement that literally had no legs whatsoever without the biblical tradition. Mm-hmm. And so when I see kind of a lot of like religious iconography and biblical iconography creeping into various, like protest movements in the American space. So even if those protest movements are sometimes like very deeply misguided on issues that I care about, I still am cheered and encouraged by the fact that it is so obvious and clear that biblical religion still resonates deep within the American soul. And so I'm pretty optimistic about the future. I guess that's my like hot take.
Yeah, well, I feel like that kind of addresses the question in the chat about, how does religious literacy extend to maybe less popular movements that maybe have like some or more controversial or less popular, but have like wide cultural cachet. And yeah, so, I guess to quote Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, like, gosh, you're an upbeat guy.
I'm like the Ned Ryerson of this conversation.
And I would also like to point out that with David's example of the advanced democracies with strong religious belief, but when he said it initially, he did also include Israel in that.
Right. When we were talking offline beforehand, I was saying that the only advanced democracy that is comparable to the US in its religiosity is Israel. Israel's obviously much smaller country, but it is definitely comparable in its religiosity to the United States.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to close out. I have one last question, because you're both religious, but you're also both culture guys, like pop culture guys and basketball guys. And I don't know anything about basketball, so I'm not going to ask you any questions about basketball.
Ja Morant, right there, best young point guard in the NBA.
Okay, all right.
Well, I'm a Knicks fan. I have nothing productive to say.
And that's a question, and you just took it and ran with it.
I have tears. I have decades of tears.
Well, I mean, since Rabbi Lamm's so comfortable sharing his hot takes, I was gonna ask, like, we're getting to the end of the year, so like any genre of pop culture, what's the thing, and it can be from this year or any time, like this is your chance, like what's the thing where you feel like you've been swimming upstream of popular opinion, but you feel like you'll eventually be vindicated?
Oh man, that is a great. Oh, that's such a good question. What's the thing that I think is awesome that may be a little bit ahead of its time?
Right, exactly.
Oh boy, that's a really good question. Okay, so in the interest of stalling, I am a big believer. Let me put it more broadly. I'm a big believer in the power of animation as like a quintessentially American medium. My brother-in-law, who is shouts to Jonathan, who is a TV connoisseur, this is like our biggest area of disagreement. He's like, I will not watch a cartoon. I'm like, no, but you have to watch BoJack Horseman.
Cartoons?
Nothing. I'm like, but how you can't even watch BoJack? He won't. But whether it's BoJack, whether it's Big Mouth, whether it's any of these other kind of animated series, I think one of the cool things that America has enabled in human history is just, and it is rooted, I think, ultimately in its biblical soul as well, is an ability to speak absolutely absurd things into being. And what David said earlier is such a good example of that. The notion that you can walk down a street in Nashville and not see like an Anchorman style like melee between Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Muslims is an absolute mind-bending, world historic miracle. And it is a testament to an ability to actually imagine a future like that and somehow, against all odds, with divine favor, bring it into being. And there is therefore, I think the best genre that expresses the ability to envision the absurd and to depict the true by doing things that are crazy is animation. And so whether it's like, honestly, I think one of the most like American moments in film, it's not a particularly good film, it just happens to be one I'm very nostalgic for, is like the original Space Jam. And it's where Bugs Bunny, this is a sentence that most of human history, like, you couldn't even comprehend it. When Bugs Bunny says to Michael Jordan, you could do anything here, this is cartoon land, right? Michael Jordan was like the quintessential person who could just do things that literally nobody else thought was possible. And I mean, his nickname was a testament to the possibility of human flight. And so I am very high on the future of animation as a prestige American entertainment genre. I guess that's my
You've definitely thought more deeply about the original Space Jam than anyone I've ever met.
I have my answer. I mean, but I've been beating this drum for a while, Maggie. Man of Steel is a top 5 superhero movie. Aquaman is a top 10 superhero movie for very different reasons. The two best kinds of superhero movies are, one, that take the premise seriously. In other words, okay, what if some super being showed up from outer space? Wouldn't we absolutely totally freak out? And then if they fought, what would that do to Man of Steel explores that. Phenomenal, amazing, best depiction of superhero combat. I mean, come on, it was incredible. Now, Aquaman is the other side of it, which says, superheroes, come on, this is silly. Let's just have fun with it. And the moment that I realized that I was in that kind of experience with Aquaman is when they were flying over the desert in North Africa and Pitbull's version of Toto's Africa comes on.
I didn't even know there was a Pitbull cover.
Oh, and
this is the best take.
It's so glorious. And I was like, oh, Pitbull singing Toto's Africa, going to this is amazing. So the two best kinds of superhero movies are the kinds that lean into the seriousness of the premise and lean into the silliness of the premise. And Man of Steel is one and Aquaman is the other. And I stand by that take.
But I think, and I won't take up any more of anyone's time, but I would like to say that I think that that's like a horseshoe theory thing though, because I think like little kids take it very seriously. Like my 5-year-old son has been going around polling people for a while now about who would win in a fight between Superman and Zorro. And it's an absurd, right? It's an absurd question, but at the same time, he's serious. Like, who would win, Zorro or Batman? And he can make a case that Zorro might have a chance.
You would kill one man to capture me. I would kill 100 men to capture you. Is one of the most iconic lines in American film.
So I would argue that they're both kind of the same. They're both kind of the same thing. Well, anyway, I would like to thank evening. This has been lovely. And I would like to thank as well everyone who joined us this evening. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer everybody's questions here, but I hope that everyone's been encouraged to think a little bit more deeply about religious literacy and the role it can play in becoming a more engaged citizen, voter, consumer of culture. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun. Thanks for having us.
Fun, wasn't it? Well, thank you very much, everyone. And I hope everyone has a good evening and a happy holidays.